teaching there because I feel like the community has always been so rich, and everybody that's there really wants to be there and is so excited to learn. And that didn't stop us when we had to go online. So here we all are. I'm very excited to talk to you about both my process and just the general process of sculpting in clay tonight. And as Vita said, if you have questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat box and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. What you will see before you, if you don't already, is a set of birds that I'm going to start talking about. Here it is, in terms of what my process is like. And so you'll see some clay sculpture tonight, and everything that I do starts out initially as clay. So this is actually a fired clay piece here. The only difference that you can see from the cast plaster next to it is the color is a little bit pink, and it's because it was fired, it shrunk ever so slightly. What I normally do is I take a clay piece, and before it's been fired, I don't actually normally ever fire my work, but I'll make a rubber mold of it. So that consists of me painting a layer of rubber over top of the clay original, which gives me a direct impression. If you can see inside this mold, you can see some texture of feathers. So this allows me to make an exact replica of my original. I also make a plaster shell that keeps this flexible rubber piece stiff. And this allows me to reproduce it exactly every single time by filling it up with plaster. I use what's called hydrocal. It's an industrial strength plaster that's relatively strong. And so what I do is, like I said, I fill it up and I get a solid plaster casting of my work, and I can make as many of these as I want. So hopefully many people want them, and I have to make 1 million. I don't send them out just like this though. What I'll usually do is I'll finish them with some sort of a coating. This is actually just a black gesso covered in graphite, which is now being referred to by me as Darla Jackson standard, just my signature sort of finish. And you can see that despite the fact that they all look different next to one another, they are exactly the same piece, just in a few different versions. Here's another little guy that is also cast in plaster, but started in clay. The reason I love clay so much is because you have the ability to make a direct impression in something that's very malleable, very inexpensive, and easy to access. And you can do a lot of things with it. So I've done small sculptures that are able to be held in your hand like this. And Paul Romano, my partner, and I, we did something, this is a life-size lioness that we did last year in our living room. I don't generally recommend sculpting 8-foot-long lions in your living room, but you do what you feel is best for you. So, so I'm going to move these guys out of the way and talk to you about what we're going to do tonight. So I'm going to work on a natural item. I pulled a few things together here to talk a little bit about what you should choose based on your skill level. So if you're somebody who is just starting out, something that's a little more simple and more compact is going to be easier than something like a skull that has a lot of holes in it. In my Fleisher class, that we tend to go all over the place with these natural items, and I try to tailor it to the skill level of the person that's working. So for tonight's sake, I'm going to choose something that's relatively simple, just so you guys can see as I follow along, but it is interesting. The most important thing, I think, is that you're sculpting something that you're interested in, because if not, you're going to get bored and you're not going to want to work on it anymore. So I'm going to pull these out of the way. I guess one of the things that we should talk about is that you can sculpt just about anything in clay. Some things are very hard to sculpt in clay and some things are very easy. So it's more a matter of your patience level, how much time you have, and how big your living room is. All right, so to get started, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about how you can set up at home. Shifting home was easy for me because my studio's at home. But what did happen when everything closed down with the pandemic is that I had to be able to sculpt in front of people very easily. And so I got a few of these little turntables. They come from IKEA. They're $12.99. and they are great because they're cheap and they're sealed, so you're not going to mess them up too much. And it's, yeah, they're easy to use and easy to get. So if you find yourself wanting to do a lot of clay sculpture, having a turntable is nice because you can move things around very easily. The next thing that you'll need, you don't want to work directly on this. You always want to put some sort of a board. Saw somebody said, classic Darla, cleverness. Oh, you're making me blush. So you'll want to put a board down so that you're not getting this dirty or messed up. I inevitably, you see, it's dirty. It'll get dirty, don't worry. But you don't want to work directly on the surface. You want to be able to wrap this up and change it out for another piece that you're working on. So I have this board, it's sealed with some house paint that probably happened like 10 years ago. You want to work on something that's been sealed ideally, because otherwise it's going to be more likely to get moldy. So that can be just a layer of paint on it. You can shellac it. You could even just put a piece of plastic over it and that will protect it. So next, we're going to talk about tools. This is my handy dandy tool roll. My friends at Peg and All make these. I love everything they make. So you don't need all of
Darla, that's so handsome.
Isn't it?
I'm jealous. It's just perfect.
This is great. They make them for, they didn't like pay me to say this or anything. I just love their stuff so much. They make them for drawing, and I said, well, I'm going to put sculpture tools in mine. And if you go online, you can see people filling theirs up with all different materials, which I love. But you'll see that I have a few favorite tools, and these are those. I'm going to pull these aside so you can see. This is just a wooden tool. It's actually homemade, and this one is a rake and can be bought at a company called Sculpture House. It's slightly specialized just because this little wire rim has notches cut out of it so that it will make a sort of a raking pattern as you bring it across the clay. The other thing I like to use and may use tonight are these stainless steel tools. I got a set of these from Dick Blick for, I think, $9.99, and they are wonderful. And I also have some rubber tipped tools, which are sort of like paintbrushes, but sculpture tools, and you know, a few other things here. So I'm gonna put these away. I just cleaned this for this purpose. This was like a dirty, clayey mess. You know, I've spiffed up for this. Another thing that you may or may not care to use is a set of calipers. This is just so if you want to be precise in your sculpting of something, you can measure it exactly. So if you want to sculpt this shell exactly, you know, you're not a robot, so you'll get close, but you'll be able to measure how wide it is, how tall it is. Calipers can help with that. I'm sort of more of a maverick. I'm like the cowboy sculptor in that I like to do it by eye and by feel, and I'll use calipers when it's necessary that I'm getting an exact likeness, but you don't always need to rely on that. Art can be anything, and that's why it's wonderful. So next, I'm gonna put these over here. You'll need a spray bottle if you're working with water-based clay. This is my fancy one. It's actually a plant mister, so it's not really that fancy, but I like it. It's important to have water around because as you're working the clay is very porous, but water moves through clay very easily, both into it and out of it. So having a spray bottle to hydrate it when it gets dried out is really important. Last but not least is the clay. So I'm going to say that this is like the most important part because you don't really need any of this stuff except for the clay. You can do a sculpture fully with your hands. You don't need to have a special sculpture tool. You can use a butter knife if you don't have a sculpture tool. You know, like I said, you can work just on a piece of plastic. You don't have to have any of this stuff. So don't let getting things ever keep you from sculpting. So clay, we're talking about clay now. This is a water-based clay. It is, I think, standard brand number 105, which has no grog in it. Grog is basically like a sand. It's made of pre-fired clay molecules, or not molecules, but you know what I that gets thrown in to help it be a little bit stronger. I don't like to work with grog because it looks like somebody put sand on the surface of your clay, but it can come in handy for larger pieces or if you like the look of it. So that's going to be a personal preference. I've been working with white clay for a few years. I worked with red clay for a few years. I feel like I go back and forth. One of my very favorite clays to work with is called Wed clay, W-E-D. There's a weird rumor that it stands for Walter E. Disney clay because a lot of the Disney people used to use it. However, it actually stands for water-based extending dryer. So, you know, maybe it could just be both and that would be fine. I'm working with water-based clay tonight because the classes I teach, we use water-based clay and we fire things. You can make molds, rubber molds, plaster molds on water-based clay. You just have to make sure not to let it dry out. The other thing that you can do if you're not interested in firing your work is use a plastiline. So it's an oil-based clay that will not dry out. And you will have to make a mold of it though, or just sit the clay piece on your shelf forever and maybe it would get smushed. I like water-based clay because I feel like it has a life. It, you know, it doesn't talk to you or anything, but it's like a plant, you know, it starts out one way and then it changes if you don't pay attention to it. So if you don't spray a piece, it's going to dry out over time, and that could be really upsetting to you if you worked on a piece for a long time. So I think that that's the thing I enjoy about it. In the beginning, it's very malleable and you can move it around very quickly, but then as it gets drier, it gets a little harder. So that is something to think about. Some people prefer to work with their clay very, very wet, like even wetter than this, so it's almost sticky. I like it at the state when it comes, you know, out of the bag as it's supposed to. So when you're getting started, you want to take a look at whatever form you're making. So whether it's this or, you know, birds or a giant lion, you want to think about the basic shape. So if I'm looking at this from a side view, we have this spiral, but if I break it down, it's just a circle with a little bit extra over here. So that's what I'm going to go for from this view. And if I look at it from this view, it's got more of a wedge shape, but it's a little rounded. So we're going to go for circle with a little extra that's a wedge shape but rounded, right? It's very high tech. I try to keep it, you know, as simple as possible. So I think the thing that is important as you guys are working is just to continue to look at the piece from multiple views. I always start out from one view, and in this case, just because I think it'll be the dominant view, is this side view. I also just read a graphic novel that was all about spirals, so I think that's why I picked this one. And if you guys have any questions as I'm doing this, again, just feel free to pop them into the chat. Anybody who has taken a class with me will know that it is me just talking while we're working. Usually about things unrelated, but it comes back around.
Hey, Darla, quick question.
Yeah.
What's the title of the graphic novel about spirals?
Yes, it's Uzumaki, I think, U-Z-U-M-A-K-I, and it's by Junji Ito, and it's amazing. The drawings are great, and it's to make spirals a scary thing. I thought, you know, would take a bit of effort, and he did it well.
Cool. And where can you purchase this clay?
So this clay in particular, I got from the ceramic shop, which is in Norristown, PA, and you can just order online. And I think they ship across the country for anybody who's not local. However, if you are local, Norristown isn't that far. I know this is something I believe that Blick also carries, so you could just go to their website as well. I will say that clay is one of those things, the more of it you buy, the cheaper it gets. It's similar to plaster. So if you get 1 box of clay, it's going to be a lot more than if you get 500 pounds of clay. So 1 box is 50 pounds and 10 boxes versus 10 boxes. So.
Cool. Thank you.
My pleasure. That's the other reason that working with clay is good, is because you always get a little bit of a workout carrying it to and fro. So the other thing that I like about water-based clay as opposed to oil-based clay is that you're able to push things around if they're not looking right at first. So I'm going to bring this over, and you can see that I'm working a little bit larger here. So I'm just going to push it back, and then I'm going to start to bring in this tool. I do most of the work in the beginning with just my hands because, I don't know, that's the fun part. I like to do that. And then as I get into more detailed work, then I'll start to use tools and other things. So one thing that I've become very aware of, especially in through teaching in general, but Zoom teaching in particular, is the noises that I was previously unaware that I make while I'm working. So if you hear little songs, just can't help it. Sculpture makes me so happy that I make little noises when I'm sculpting.
That's adorable.
Can't help it. All right.
So you seem to be doing this kind of additive process?
Yes.
Kind of layering on bits by bit?
Yes.
Can you speak a little to that?
Absolutely. So sculpture is one of those things. If you ask, 10 different people their opinions, you're going to get 10 different answers. There are purists who would be solely additive. There are people who believe when you're doing clay sculpture, you should only be adding and never taking away. And I say, poo to that, because the whole benefit of working with clay is that it's so easy to add and remove materials. However, there are people, I think that, and again, this is a sensibility thing. So I almost think that you should take a personality test before you start any sort of sculpture, just to find out which type you are. Maybe it could be an Instagram quiz or something. But some people like to start with a basic form and let it dry out a little and start to carve away. So it becomes a very subtractive process. I'm going to say sort of in the middle. I like to add and I like to subtract. And I think that as you're working on a piece, it can change. And I think that that's some of the best part. Your intentions in the beginning you may shatter them to pieces as you continue to work, and you see something that you want to highlight that you might not have otherwise if you planned it out perfectly and were only adding and put these limitations on yourself. But some people like limitations, and some people need to, put their working in a box in some capacity, and that's fine too. But I prefer being both additive and subtractive. Maybe it's like 60-40. Maybe I'm 60% additive and 40% subtractive.
So as you add on the clay, you're doing this like smoothing action in a way. Can you just, because I can see it, but I'm wondering, like, verbally, can you walk us through the process?
Absolutely. So what happens in the beginning is you want to get the basic form. And so I'm feeling like this is looking, closer and closer to the basic form as I'm starting to do this. However, if I just left each lump of clay as it was on there, it would be harder to perceive it as a whole, because each of these little lumps of clay is changing, the light and shadow that's on a piece. And so it may be harder for you guys to see. I have a light here, so you can see it on this, how the light is hitting at this sort of highest point in this break in this shell. Maybe if I hold it up a little bit, you can see how it it turns, and because of the light on it, I'm trying to replicate that form here. And if it's a bunch of, this is a dramatization for television here, but if it's a bunch of chunks put together, it's going to be harder for me to specifically pick out those forms. So what I do is I'll put clay on like this, but then I want to start to combine those forms. And this is a very simplified form, and because I wanted to pick something that we could do in less than an hour, but anything that you're looking at, you're going to just be, a human body is not but a billion of these shells put together in some way or another. It's not exactly true, but you get the idea, is that we're just looking for little forms that are then getting put together as a whole. So I like to do this basically for peace of mind, so that I can just see where I'm at, and enjoyment. Some people can work with their clay very messy until the very end, or some people never clean up the clay, and that's, again, a matter of personal preference.
So it seems like you're looking for light, much like you would in drawing for light and shadow, I mean.
Absolutely. I think that light in sculpture is, I try not to live and die by anything in sculpture. I'm not gonna, meaning that I try not to get too tied to anything, because I like to explore what might happen along the way. But if I'm following anything in a sculpture, it's how the light is hitting a piece. So light and shadow are describing the form, and if I'm trying to replicate a form, then I want to follow the light. And if you match up the light on your piece to the piece you're working from, usually you can get a very, very close replication without doing any measuring at all. And so, again, it depends on what your preference is. Do you want to make something exactly, or are you just trying to make your interpretation of it? So that's going to depend a lot on you. But I think that if you're trying to get the essence or the idea of something conveyed well, following the forms that you're seeing in the light is a really, really big help.
That's fascinating, because I don't think I've ever thought of it that way. I think of drawing that way, that you're certainly following light and shadow. But from my own very limited experience of sculpting, I think more of like volume and form. But that's so helpful to also really think about, like, how is light reflecting off an object, and it certainly guides your perception of the volumes and the forms, for sure. So that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. The light is just describing those volumes and forms like it would, in a drawing, but you're thinking about it just three-dimensionally rather than breaking it down two-dimensionally. And that's one of the things, I don't know, I love about it, is I think that a lot of times people do separate drawing and sculpture. And obviously they're different, because I'm way better at sculpting than I am at drawing. But I think one of the things that is important is how they inform one another. So while I don't draw a huge amount to a finished product, very rarely making finished drawings. I will sketch a lot to figure things out. But there is an artist that I love. Her name is Nicola Hicks, Hicks, and she works predominantly with plaster and straw. So she's putting things together in that way, where they're almost put together very roughly, and then she refines them as she goes. But what happens is, if she gets stuck on a sculpture, she'll go to a drawing, and she works on big pieces of craft paper on her studio wall. And when they're exhibited, they're just shown in that state. They're just pieces of craft paper on a gallery wall, rather. And that her ideas are formed in either the drawing or the sculpture, and then they're refined in the other. And so she'll go back and forth between them to work out these problems or issues or ideas that she's having, as she's working on each of these pieces. And so I teach, like I said, over at the Academy, in addition to Fleisher and Stockton, and a lot of the students there have drawing classes and sculpture classes. And I talk about that a lot, how you can work out something in sculpture, but then if you have a real problem, take it to a drawing, and then you may see exactly what's happening in the drawing rather than in the sculpture. And it'll allow you to go back to the sculpture more informed about what you want to do. So as I'm going on this, I'm starting to look, so I was looking only at the side, and I'm not bringing this to a full finish, but I'm starting to look up around the edge here. And so I know these are sort of the same color, so I'm going to do it like this. And you can see that this has more of an angle. It's rounded again, whereas mine is very, flat here. So I want to get more of a pitch in this direction. So it almost has this sort of, not a point exactly, but it comes to a spot right here that I want to replicate over here. So I'm going to start to look for that shape from above. So I usually, like I said, I start from one view and then I just start to work my way around, and then eventually we'll get to the other side and I'll flip it around. The other thing that Zoom Talks has made me very aware of is that I very much talk with my hands, and I'm okay with that, but I just didn't realize how much I did it. And so for those of you who are watching and are like thinking about how, well, this is just a shell and I'm here for, baby bunnies and dead birds or whatever Darla normally sculpts, I apply the idea the same way I do here with the shell in the simplest form to things like this and like this. So when I'm looking at images, usually I'm using reference images as I'm working. If I don't have, baby bunnies and crow masks sitting in front of me as models, as much as I wish I would, and two-headed birds. What I like to do is I'll either do a drawing or I will work with images that I gather from the internet. If I'm working on something large, I'll work from multiple images. I mean, this lioness, Paul did a life-size drawing of it, just a basic one. And then we worked from, 40 images that we had printed out for details. And so we're working from a lot of different references if we're not working from something direct like this. And you start out the same way, thinking about from a certain view, from this piece, and even from the other piece here, what's its basic shape from above? I want to get that silhouette. You almost want to think about it, I always say this, like a ship emerging from the fog. So if you see a ship in the fog, at first you're only going to see a giant silhouette. And, as it gets closer, you're going to start to see more and more details until you're seeing tiny little, rivets and people waving at you from windows and stuff. So you want to think about all these basic shapes first before you get into the details. And certainly things like texture, you need to leave that till the end because that's basically like the icing on the cake. So I'm going to flip this. And one thing that I can recommend too, as you guys are working, if you are sculpting something that is very geometric, I guess I'll say, if you're working with something that has a lot of finite lines within it or things that you want to replicate exactly, drawing on your sculpture is always a good idea. If I'm doing something that's more like this, I'll sketch on it to get an idea of where wings will go, and then I'll start adding clay. Something like this is a little bit more straightforward, so I don't need to do that as much. But as I'm looking at it from above here, I want to start to say like, okay, maybe my lines will be something like this. And another thing that I do, so light is very important, and I'm always looking for angles. So the way I'm saying this might be a little different from how you are, but this edge here, I'll hold my tool up to it to get that rough angle, and then I'll bring it over here to make sure that I've got something similar. It's actually a little different because I think mine's a little flatter this way, and it's going to be hard to see because they're not exactly in the same position for you guys. But this one kicks out just a little bit more, whereas mine's a little tipped back. So I know I want to add some more clay to get a little bit more form in here to replicate this. And as you're working with the clay, if you find that the stuff that you've been touching is drying out too much, what you can do is just put it back in your bag and spray it and just grab some new clay. As I said earlier, clay moves water through it very quickly. And so it's going to absorb water quickly and it's going to shed water quickly. And especially if you're touching it, you're going to absorb it out of the clay. So, and another thing while I'm here and talking about clay is you never want to spray something so much that it's sitting in a puddle or even coated in a really wet pile. You don't want it to look like somebody dumped a glass of water on it. You want it to look like somebody gently misted it. So my spray bottle is not the finest of sprays, but I put some on, and because it's wet on the surface, you can see that shine now. I'm going to let it soak in until it's not such a shiny surface. It's going to go more matte again, and then it'll be okay to work it. If I continue to work it while the surface is so wet, what's going to happen is it's just going to get muddy and slippery and sticky, and I'm not about that life. I am very excited to have, it be as neat as possible right now. And I just learned a trick the other day that I'm very excited about. So clay, if you're working with clay a lot, you'll find that it can mold. So you can get a little bit of mold in your bag. It can be on the clay itself. Mold isn't terrible for clay. You don't want it to be like a really crazy funky mold, but molds can allow clay to become a little bit more malleable and more plastic. Some people go for, I don't know, a very funky clay. I don't particularly, but you don't want your clay to get super moldy. And so to combat that, some people will put bleach in their spray bottles, which I don't like because I don't want to smell bleach while I'm working. And I also had someone come into my studio once and spray someone else with a spray bottle that did have bleach in it. And it caused me a small heart attack, and everyone was okay in the end, but I just stopped using bleach. But somebody recently, an artist named Christina Cordova, who does fire everything. She's a really amazing ceramic artist. She lives in North Carolina now, but she is originally from Puerto Rico. She does over life-size ceramic figures that are being fired. And she mentioned in a workshop that if you put a little bit of tea tree oil, which I like anyway, into your spray bottle, it will help combat mold. So I would say so long as you're not allergic to tea tree oil, you will be fine. So helpful hints here with Darla Jackson. It's like I'm on a talk show. So there's this funny little form in the back here that I'm trying to get from this view. And I'm trying to keep this piece from sticking to the board too much, just because I want to be able to pick it up and move it around. There will be times when you're sculpting something that you won't want to have come off the board. Like when I sculpted this piece, the birds here, it stayed very stuck to the board until the mold was made, which was my preference at that time. So again, I'm checking back in with that top view, and I know I can see I still want to add some clay here. So it's always going to be about checking as you guys are looking through and working on this. And one of the problems I see with a lot of people who are just starting out is they fix something and then they never look at that part of the sculpture again because they've fixed it. And so I think that as you're working, you should continually be looking at the whole. You want to focus on areas that you're working on, but you always want to step back and look at it. So whether that's you're physically stepping back and getting a little bit of space between you and your sculpture, which is especially helpful with figurative sculpture, that is going to be helpful for you to the overall view of the piece. If your face is very close to the sculpture the whole time, it's going to be hard to get a really good idea of whether or not everything is actually as you want it to be. How's everybody doing? Are there any questions about anything? And anything I've either talked about or haven't talked about yet? I'm happy to answer questions as best I can. One of the things I think that is most important as you're working is, and again, this goes for anything. So whether you're working on a figure or an animal sculpture or an inanimate object or an item from nature, that basic shape is always going to be what you're going for first. Once you have a basic shape that you're enjoying, you're going to start to look at big details. So this is that ship emerging from the fog. So you want to look for things that are going to be more important to the piece. Your fine details you don't really want to worry about until closer to the end. But the exception to this rule is if you really can't see something without putting a detail in, then it's time to add it. So I say sometimes to my students, let annoya be your guide. I think that's not a word, but it is like letting paranoia be your guide. But if you're so annoyed at something and it's not there yet that you need to add it, then just add it. It's just sculpture. It's fine. Just do it. Just so you're all aware, I think that my viewpoint on sculpture, and maybe this helps sort of frame, I'm very serious about sculpture, but I am also of the mindset that sculpture can be very fun and very easy to do by people who have done it a lot or never before. I think that you don't have to be an expert to have fun with sculpture, and you don't have to be a beginner to have fun. Like, everybody should be having fun as they're going is my preference, because otherwise, why are we here? So that's why I'm making things like baby bunnies and crow masks and the like. So another thing I haven't talked about yet exactly is the fact that this is hollow and this is solid. So for any ceramicists that are here with us tonight, some people will work in the ceramics world hollow the whole time. So they would start by constructing a slab or just a flat piece of clay and rolling it and fixing it until it gets to the shape that they want. So the piece would be hollow the whole time. Whereas other people are going to start with a solid lump of clay like I did and hollow it out later. That is almost always my preference because I'm able to push the clay around more forcefully. If it was hollow right now, what would happen is I'd have to be very, very delicate. And I don't know, for any of you who have met me, I'm not exactly the most delicate person I know in any capacity. So I prefer to be able to sort of push things around as I need to and not be bound by being too careful with sculpture. I like that you're able to be a little rough and tumble with clay. That's one of the fun parts. So you see that I drew this opening here because I'm looking for a certain shape. And so I'm just trying to get that curve in there. And I'm going to go back to this side. So again, as you guys are working, it's just a matter of going around and around the piece. So you're doing your first pass, basic shape, and then as you're getting into your second layer, not layer, let's not say layer, that's confusing. Your second go round here, you're gonna start to add more detail. So as I'm looking, I can see that this part of the shell just has more form than I'm giving it. So I'm adding that now. And for those of you who are working and firing your work, clay, low fire clay, which this is, tends to shrink about 7%. And very rarely do you notice it, with the exception of when you're holding it up against something that you've sculpted it from directly, or you, in this case, as with this bird, I fired the clay original, so it's a bit smaller than the plaster casting was. You'll rarely see it, and you'll rarely notice it because it's such a small percentage. But if you were to ever sculpt something, say like your hand, and you put it next to your hand later, you would in fact notice that. So if you do want something to be true to size, it's better to scale it up ever so slightly. And you could really nerd out like I would, have a good time doing, and figure out what size it needed to be to shrink that 7%. However, it's not always going to be exact. So if you live and die by that idea, you may be sad later. So if you're going for an approximation, that will be okay. So now we're getting this drawn in. And so you can see that this is a bit of a mess still right here. And so now I'm going to get into this stage where I want to clear this up a bit. There's going to be a lot of things that you guys may go to sculpt. I run into this in my clay class often, is people will start sculpting something that looks very easy. And I think sometimes the simplest things are deceptively, they look deceptively simple, and they are not actually. So always cut yourself some slack if you have chosen something that you feel like should have been very simple and it was not. What I'll do is I'll continue to refine this after the demo tonight, and I'll put a picture of it up on my Instagram, which is where I tend to share a lot of my work. And we'll go through the firing process as well. One of the things I really enjoy, in addition to teaching at Fleisher, is I love to just share information online, just because I feel like there are so many aspects of sculpture that people do a little bit differently, or that I think are harder for people to understand, and seeing someone do it makes it more approachable and easier to understand. So I really do enjoy that aspect of the process, and just the free sharing of information. That's why I love classes at Fleisher so much, is because everybody's always so knowledgeable and so willing to share the information. So as I'm going around, I'm tightening up this spiral and trying to refine it. And so it's, again, what we talked about a little bit in the beginning, is And you see I keep wiping the clay here just because it's easier to clean off the tool. One of the things that you will notice is if you're working with a tool, it will gather clay. It still has some on it, but I keep trying to keep the tip clean, because if you have dry clay on the tip of your tool, what's going to happen is it's going to convey that mark onto your finished piece. And so what happens is you will have, rather than a smooth shell, you'll have dirty clay tool mark, finish, shell. And if that's what you're going for, that is great. I actually used to finish my rabbit sculptures. Their fur was a clay tool, you know, mark making that I would do. And one of the other things that I'm doing here, which may be easy to see or understand or not, but I'm working both sides of this line here, because if I do just one side, it's not quite enough. And if I'm doing both sides, it becomes a little bit easier to clean that up. And this goes for things like skin folds. Like when you see a pressed line and a skin fold like this, you're always going to want to work one side of that line and then also the other. And if you find yourself working with clay and you're getting very dried out hands, it's because as you're sucking moisture out of the clay again is also sucking moisture out of you. So I feel like you may want to, I don't know, lotion, right? That helps. And so I just keep turning this around in my hands. Some people really enjoy working in their hands and others do not. So if you don't enjoy it, what would be ideal is for you to make it so that your modeling stand is a little more at eye level so that you can get up closer to your pieces and see what's happening. I usually like my eye level to fall sort of in the middle of the piece, but it will depend on the piece. So I missed a spot back here. As you move forward, again, this is the idea of checking as you go, going back to areas that you missed a little bit. And you're gonna wanna always have a light hand. So think about it like you're carrying an egg. You don't wanna crush it. You wanna hold it very gently, like a baby chicken. So pretend like you're holding a baby chicken, and then we'll all be happy. I love animals, can you tell? Most of my sculpture instruction is food references and talking about animals. And you'll see that I'm using my thumb to just gently go back over. I haven't had call to use this rake much, but I'll show you the texture. It's a little hard to see actually with this camera. But what it does is if you go over the piece back and forth very gently, it makes sort of a crosshatch pattern. And my interest is not so much just smoothing out the piece with my thumb here, but I'm using my thumb, you know, the texture in my fingerprint as a very tiny rake. So I try to go back and forth over the surface of the clay, not so that it's as smooth as possible, like smooth and shiny, but so that it's a consistent roll. And this is something that's a little harder to explain, but it's that I'm trying to just unify that surface in a way that there's not so many lumps and bumps, and then also just have it have a nice sort of neutral texture.
Darla, we have just a couple more minutes, about 5 left.
Okay.
I know I said I would tell you at 15.
That's okay. I was just talking.
I know, I was just so caught up in your presentation. I don't know if you happen to see that question about, do you use a mirror to help see different perspectives?
I did not see any of the questions.
Okay.
So feel free to pop any of them to me. I occasionally will use a mirror. I'm more likely now to use a picture. I'll take a picture on my phone and look at it. I have had mirrors set up in the studio in the past, and I enjoy that. So it is good to look at things in a different way. So whether it be you're taking a picture of it and looking at it, or you're looking at it in a mirror, yes, I love to do that because it's very helpful.
And another question, will this technique work if the sculpture is to be fired?
Yes. So what you will want to do, and maybe I'll jump from finishing this circle, is that because this is such a jam-packed little piece of clay here, and it's a solid lump, you would want to hollow it out. So I would use a loop tool, which is just a piece of wire that has been a certain way, and I'll hold the piece in my hands. And you don't want to do this when the clay is too wet, nor too dry. So you want to find that perfect spot sort of in the middle. And you want to start to carefully remove clay. And depending on, you know, what you're going for, you definitely don't want your clay really to be any thicker than a 1/2 inch. If you're new to this, you can err on that thicker side. Ideally, though, you're going thinner than that in terms of how thick the clay is. And so what I like to do is I'll dig a little out, and you can pinch the clay and sort of gauge it, see how thick it is. So it's thinner at this edge, but it's thicker back here. And so I'll just continue to slowly hollow this form out. What's going to happen is it starts to turn. So if I just kept digging straight down, what would happen is that this would poke a hole through. So that would not be good. This happens also in the inside of faces. If you were to do a portrait of someone and hollow it out, you know, the eyes and the nose and the mouth are not all on the same plane. So you can't just generically hollow it out. You have to follow the form. So that's why I like to have my hand here, is if I get too close to the edge, I start to feel the variation in the clay wall. So you'll just feel the tool through the wall of it. If you were to poke through, it's not, you know, the end of the world. You can just put a piece of clay back there and go about your day. But it feels better when you successfully hollow out a piece and don't put a hole through. Now what happens is sometimes you'll have a piece like this where you can't really get into the other side of it, in which case you would take a clay wire and cut it in half and then hollow it out. So let me actually grab one. This is the part that scares everyone. It's terrifying. So this is why you would go to hollow before you did a lot of really fine detail. And because I already started to do this, I'm gonna cut off a chunk of the back, not the whole thing. And so I'm using this wire and putting a gentle pressure. And I'm gonna pop that off and save this piece because I'm notoriously bad at accidentally squishing the pieces that I cut off. But that's still part of your sculpture. And I'll make a rough guesstimate of what I want to hollow out. Again, this is a little on the thicker side, but for something this small, it wouldn't really be a big deal. And again, I want to just hold this gently. And I'm hollowing through until I get to that other side that we had started to hollow already. So I'm starting to poke through.
And Darla, can you tell us why it's important to hollow clay out?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is as you're adding clay, especially if you're doing what I did and putting on lots of little pieces at the same time, you can run into air bubbles. I try to compress the clay as I go. So a lot of me pushing it all together is, you know, pushing out any of those air bubbles. But say I were to just close this back up and it was just one big air bubble. What happens is when you fire it, the the water in the clay has to go somewhere. So it'll either go out this way or it'll go into that air bubble. And as the steam builds up, if it has nowhere to go, it'll just explode and your piece will be in a million little pieces on the bottom of the kiln. So we hollow things out to prevent that from happening. And so you're both compressing the sidewalls of the clay as you're hollowing out, and you're removing a lot of the material. So it's going to be less likely to happen. There are also people who will take a pin tool, which looks just like a needle, and they'll poke a lot of holes in the inside of a piece too. I very rarely do that because I find, especially at Fleisher, I've never had any problem with firing. I'm gonna knock on wood for that, just in case. But it's you know, it can be a helpful thing just to poke additional holes. That's sort of like belts and suspenders. And so you can see into the piece from this side, and you can see into it from this side, and there's a bit of a hole through. It's not a huge hole, but if I stick my tool in one side, it comes out the other. What you're aiming for is to have this piece be as consistently thin as possible all the way around. So you don't want to have one side be really thick and the other side be really thin. And then you can make the inside really nice or not, that's up to you. Here's this other little side, which is likely thin enough, but I'm just gonna take a little. And then to get this back together in the right way, you wanna do what's called slipping and scoring. So I like to get that edge a little wet, get this edge a little wet. You're gonna scratch it up or score it. I gave you a 10 out of 10. That was a joke. I'm hysterical. This is what it's like being
hilarious. It took me a minute. I was 10 out. I was scoring.
Sorry, it's like I'm a walking dad joke. I can't help it. Again, anyone who's taken a class with me will know it's basically all bad jokes and us talking about zombies. So
and that's what makes it so great.
I like it. So I'm going to take these two things. They're still pretty wet. If the clay had dried significantly, I would put a little bit more water. Some people use actual slip. I just rely, I'm not doing anything that's like structural, so I'm just relying on the slip that's being made by the clay itself. And then I'm putting it back on and pushing in. You'll see that there's a bit of a line there. So I like to do what I have called the Frankenstein stitch. I don't think that's the technical term for this, but again, I'm not a ceramicist. I am just a sculptor who sometimes fires things. But fun fact, I'm usually afraid of firing things because I'm afraid they'll blow up. I've had pretty good luck in the last long while. I'm gonna knock on wood again just in case. But so I'll go all the way around and do that, which drags the clay from one side into the other side. If you can get inside, it's always a good idea to smooth it from the inside, but if you can't, it shouldn't be too big a deal as long as you've done a good job on this side. So then what I'll start to do, again, is use my tool to start to bring that form from one side to the other. And I'm using my finger to smooth it back out. And
Darla, is the lion still in your living room?
no. So what happened was similar to what we talked about with the birds is we sculpted the lion, and then in order to cast the piece, we had to make a rubber mold. So we made the rubber mold in our living room, and then we cast it. We moved the mold to the garage, and so we wouldn't have been able to fit it out the door at all. And so we moved the mold to the garage, and then I cast it in, Paul and I cast it in plaster in the garage. And so if you go, if you're active on Instagram, you can find some pictures of that whole process if you scroll a bit back. We did it about this time last year because it was for a show at Arch Enemy Arts in November that Paul and I had together. The lioness currently is at Arch Enemy Arts. We were getting ready to move it, and the pandemic hit, so she's just been there. And So we will move her soon. I'm not sure where she's going to go next, but we will find a spot.
Well, this is amazing, Darla. Thank you so much. Do you guys have any other questions before we go?
Yeah, I didn't see these. Sorry, I can't multitask in that way. Oh, yay.
Thank you.
Oh, good. Lion, I see that. Yeah, so you said that I answered the question about slip. Yeah, some people will add slip. You can always just make some slip. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, slip is just a highly hydrated or liquidized clay body. So it's just, you can mix some clay and water to make slip. Or if you go to Fleisher, there's giant buckets of it in the basement. So like I said, I'll finish this and I'll post it. I'll get into some of the details and I'll talk a little bit about anything I do that I didn't cover here. But for those of you who are interested, you can find me on Instagram at Darla Jackson Sculpture, which is also my website, darlajacksonsculpture.com. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, Darla. And if you'd like to study with Darla, she has a sculptural forms class where you will be learning how to sculpt in clay coming up this fall. Registration for the class is open and live. You can find it on our website. Darla, do you want to say anything about the class?
So I guess it will run similarly to how it does in person, in that every week will be a different clay sculpture. So usually the way I break it down is that 1 week is a natural item. So we start off with simple things like shells and, you know, it could be whatever you have around your home. And then the next week I like to move into a geometric object. So you're sculpting something with more hard edges. And I generally tend to find that some people identify with one of those things or the other. So they like hard line sculpture or they like more natural organic objects. And after that, we go into sculpting fabric, which can be either a recognizable thing like a sock or a hanky, or just an abstract sort of fabric form. And that combines the hard line of geometric objects against natural forms, which is pretty fun. From there, I'll generally go into sculpting bones. And so if we're in person, I use animal bones and shells and skulls and things, but you can sculpt, you know, whatever you have available to you. And then I will do a small scale portrait, and we'll use photo reference from that and some handy dandy websites that have model reference on them. And then I'll leave room for people to sculpt something that they're interested in particular. So sort of a free form sculpt what you want project. So.
Cool. That sounds great. That sounds like a fun class. I need to take it. I haven't worked in clay in so long.
It's so fun.
It really is. There's such an immediacy in molding something in clay. It's so satisfying. Well, Darla, I don't want to keep you any longer, or all of you who came. Thank you so much for joining us. So great to see so many familiar faces. This is our last week of Fleisher from a Distance for the summer. We're going to take a break for August, and then we'll return in September. So just 2 more events coming up this week. Join us. It's on the calendar. One is a monoprint demonstration with Diane Pico. And our final event is a celebration with Bernard Collins, our faculty member, as well as a poet, and he will be doing spoken word. So fun events. Please join us. Hope to see you again. Otherwise, Darla, thank you so much. This was amazing, as always. We really appreciate the time that you've taken tonight. And thank you, everybody. Stay safe. Stay cool. It's really hot out there. And hope to see you soon.
Thank you, guys.
Right. Have a good night. Bye.